For this demo, I will use Apollo Studio. This is one of the GraphQL Explorers available to us. There are others like GraphIQL, GraphQL Playground, but all of them do work in pretty much the same way. They provide a developer a place to play around with the GraphQL API. A developer can now see what is available, send out test queries, and also get the response. Think of it as Postman, but for GraphQL. For the API, I'm using countries API. This is a publicly available GraphQL API, and we can use it for our experimentation here. Before we go ahead and write a query, let's quickly jump on to this section, documentation section, and I wanted to explain a bit about it. So this is a section that all GraphQL APIs do have. Uh, all of them do have a built-in documentation coming from the schema that they have. Before you create a GraphQL API, you need to create the schema. And because you have that schema, these explorers are now able to introspect the endpoint and provide you information about what is available. So this is a list of queries that is available to us. And then if you click on either one of these, you'll get more information about it. So we are looking at countries query, and then the output of this will be list of countries. What does this country object looks like though? So it has these fields available to us. We can decide which fields we need, and based on that, we can retrieve those. If there were descriptions available for these fields in the schema, they will also show up here. But in this case, it doesn't seem like the developer has added those descriptions. But nonetheless, I think this is really helpful because even without description, to some extent, it is self-explanatory, and we have information about all the data points, all the fields that is available to us. So let's go ahead and use countries query. And for now, let's just get the name of the country. So let's run that. And in the response, we get exactly what we asked for, which is name of all the countries in the database. But what if that's not enough? What if the use case needs currency as well? So we can add that, and we have currencies as well now in the response. Just to show you how powerful GraphQL API could be when there are relationships, let's quickly go ahead and get the continent for these countries. And note that continent is not really uh, a native field, or it's not really a string, Boolean data type value. Instead, it's an object on its own. And that's why now you need to define what specific field inside this object do you need. So let's just go ahead with name for now, and we should have that information. And we can go further. Based on a use case, we can have a very complex query or a very simple one. We used the relationship from countries to continent, but continents have a relationship to countries if we look at it from the other direction. So, and the developer has implemented that for us. So let's go ahead and use that and get countries from these continents. So now what we are getting is list of countries for each country, their currency, the continent that they are in, and then list of countries which are in the same continent as the country. And we are getting this information not just for one country, but all the countries in the database. So we were able to get a lot of data all in one call, even when they were different objects. And it is possible that these different objects may be coming from different data sources, different databases on the back end, or different uh, overall endpoints in the backend, and then GraphQL could be making those calls to different data sources and providing us this data after gluing them up together. And for now, we looked at these objects which were related, but it's not really important or necessary to get just those objects. We can even get objects which have no relationship to each other. So we can get, for example, languages. Now, countries do have a relationship with languages, but in this case, we are not really considering that relationship. Instead, We are trying to get languages independent of these countries. We are not really utilizing that relationship. And when we get this information, we should get list of countries, but also list of languages as we ask for. So in case of GraphQL, you can get as much or as less data depending on what your use case is. There are obviously practical constraints like uh, amount of data network would handle with acceptable latency and amount of data a server is able to serve with acceptable latency. But apart from that, you can get as much or as less data as you need. Sometimes it might be optimal to get some information first, show it on the web page so that user is not really waiting for information. And then in the backend, follow up with more call, a big to get a bigger chunk of data and then cache it. But all of this needs to be decided by the front end developer, and they have uh, more visibility into what the user experience would look like because they are the ones who design the user experience. I wanted to add another piece to this demo quickly. So we looked at two queries. We looked at countries and languages, but none of them really required an input from the user. Uh, just like APIs and REST, we do have queries in GraphQL which requires an input from the user, and based on that input, output is returned. Looking at this set of queries, seems like code is a query which needs, or sorry, country is a query which needs an argument named code. So let's try to use that. And it's of type string. This seems like an uh, bug with Apollo Studio. This is actually of type ID, but let's try to run it without providing any value. And we get that error saying code is required, and it's of type ID exclamation. Uh, ID is essentially string data type, but then it has uh, another layer of information added for GraphQL. ID means this is a primary key for this object. And then GraphQL would use this for caching and other optimizations. And uh, if we are caching data, it would replace the object if we get an object with the same ID. Uh, so let's try to add that code as it's a required field. Uh, and I say it's a required field because we say it's ID exclamation. Exclamation means a required field. So it's not a string. We know that it's an ID. So let's try now. No, still have an error. And we have an error because I provided a null value for code. As I said, code is a required field and we cannot really provide null value. So let's provide a valid value for this. And now this should work. And when I tried to add code, uh, the Explorer automatically created this code variable and then added this variable value in the variable section. But you don't really need to do it like this if you're just playing around. Uh, Sorry about that. You can provide that information directly here, and then this should work as well. Let's get rid of this and then try it out. And it does work. Uh, so for playing around, it's probably okay to write that information right there, but ideally you would want to separate it out. You should have a non-changing part, which is a query. This doesn't change for every call. Versus variable is something that could change for every call. So you want to separate out that information. You want to keep your shape, which is what are the different fields that you want in operations, and then variables should be the arguments that are being passed on. And this is something that you would anyways need to do once you are using a client like a Java, GraphQL client, Python client, because that makes it very easy for you to get some information from, let's say, the front end field and then pass it on without really changing the operation. And operation becomes something that doesn't change. It may change over time, but doesn't really change between calls. It can be static for your code version and changes between your code versions, but variables are something that would change per call.